going to get started in a few minutes. Good evening, everyone. I'm Eve Kahn. I'm head of the Grow Your Club's Special Functions Committee, and it is an extraordinary honor to serve on the council of this organization because the people who come speak here are the finest minds making discoveries at the frontiers of what we understand about the printed word and image. This is a unique hybrid clubhouse, library, and museum founded in the 1880s. We're open to the public for free, 6 days a week, 11 months a year, but we're called a club, and so people don't realize every cultured New Yorker needs to come here. And every cultured tourist actually needs to come here too. The current show is absolutely rivetingly fascinating. It's a fraction of the collection of the illuminated manuscripts at Jewish Theological Seminary, which only has a handful of vitrines, right? They can't really show their collection. So this is an extraordinary opportunity for our star this evening, Miriam Udel, to give a presentation. So she is the Judith London Evans Director of the Tam Institute of Jewish Studies at Emory University, an associate professor of Yiddish language, literature, and culture. Her research focuses on aspects of the Jewish encounter with modernity, including Yiddish children's books, which are the subject of her new book from Princeton University Press. And run, don't walk to buy it. This evening it is for sale and signing, and it's October, and the holidays are just around the corner. And this book belongs at the base of every menorah. And if they ask me, it also belongs at the base of every Christmas tree around. It is groundbreaking work. Miriam earned her AB and PhD degrees from Harvard. She is an ordained rabbi, and she has become my beloved friend in the past few years. We started out with a Zoom call, and then it's just built and built and built from there. My new book is about Zoe Anderson Norris, who was a journalist reformer who lived on the Lower East Side in the 1910s and documented desperate immigrant poverty in her own magazine. And she also fought against xenophobia and anti-Semitism, documenting the lives of the newest arrivals at Ellis Island. And then, because of Miriam, I've kind of put myself trying to see the lens of how the children of these immigrants, the Yiddish-speaking children, were entering their own different kinds of modernity. So Miriam sparks conversations everywhere she goes. I would enjoy actually hearing her simply read a Yiddish phone book. You're all in for a treat this evening, and thank you, Miriam, and welcome to the podium.
Thank you. You all sense from the quality and the warmth of that introduction what sort of a person Eve Kahn is and what sort of a place the Grolier is, where I'm so honored to be invited back. I'm frankly a little bit emotionally overwhelmed at who is in the crowd with me here tonight. Cherished, beloved teachers of mine, students of mine, friends going all the way back to, I think, sophomore year of high school gets the oldest friend credit, but then several more that followed not too far behind. Newer friends and colleagues, some of whom I met just last year when I was a fellow at the Center for Jewish History, friends from the Jewish community, from really every walk of my life, and two very special guests in the production of this book, my editor from Princeton, Anne Savarese, and my agent and Grolier Club member, Susan Schulman. I'm just so grateful to all of you for being with us. And I'm grateful to four people who are joining us on the live stream, who are also mentioned on the dedication page of my book. My dad is out there somewhere in cyberspace. My mom is too, and tomorrow is her birthday, so I'm wishing her an early happy birthday. And my beloved partner in thought, dance, care, everything, Adam Zachary Newton, is home with Emmanuel Newton Udel, who wondered whether I would say his name. So hopefully they're tuned into a screen seeing that. All right. So this is a little bit challenging in the sense that my tasks tonight are to launch this book and to tell you about this book, but also to speak about the book as physical object in a way that would be meaningful to the habitués of the Grolier Club, who are used to seeing absolutely stunning books as objects. And I think my sense is that they're not snobbish about it. They don't only have an interest in pretty books, but one of the really noticeable things about the early years of Yiddish children's literature in particular is that there is such a yawning disparity between the quality of what's being written and the quality of the physical objects that were produced. And I had an opportunity last year to go and spend time with some of these early books from really the first decade in which there was Yiddish children's literature. And this is all material that didn't make it into the book, but I consider this the bridge between the very start of this enterprise and when Yiddish children's literature really got going. So we're going to focus tonight on some strategies from the earliest years of Yiddish children's literature between 1900 and World War I. And I go into it in depth in the book. But the very first strategy, given the lack of this literature and the perceived need for it, was to retrofit the classics. So what you see here is commonly regarded as the first Yiddish children's story. Now, that is not true. In 1889, Mordechai Spector wrote a story specifically for children called Kids, and it's a Purim story. It's about two elementary school-age boys who are recruited into a charitable mission on behalf of old Shmerel, the water carrier, who is no longer able to really provide for his family. But this story about a child by a much better-known author, Shalom Aleichem, who wrote the Tevye stories on which Fiddler on the Roof is based, and I'm sure that 100% of the people in this room have encountered Fiddler on the Roof in some form. He was kind of pressed into service. And what he was asked to do in this story was to give it a happy ending, because children need happy endings. That's part of the emerging perception by the turn of the 20th century of what children require. And so it's like most of his holiday tales, it's very depressing. It's a very sad story. Terrible things happen. One child absolutely sabotages another child's carefully assembled holiday flag, apple, candle combo for the holiday of Simchas Torah, and accidentally on purpose burns the whole thing up. It's not a happy story. So how are you going to give that a happy ending? Well, there's a narrative U-turn. So if it's a depressing story, then the ending that gets tacked on is, well, I grew up, things got better, I survived it. You know, everything gets better, kids. Don't worry. So if we look more closely at this, we could see that it was published November 1st, 1900. And I think that it is something of a riposte to something else that ran in the same newspaper, Der Yid, a few months earlier in June of that year, which is an article that ran over 2 weeks. It was good and meaty, called Was sollen unsere Kinder lesen? What should our children read? So this is an article by Reuven Breinen, who argues that Jewish children are different than other children in Europe or really anywhere else. They're more cerebral, and they will differ as adults in ways that make them more reliant on books, this is his claim, than other people would be. They were going to get their bread mostly not by the work of their hands, but by the work of their minds. And so the question of what Jewish children would read was very formative and very urgent. And he said, we don't pay enough attention to children's reading material, and bad reading will actually sicken them. And he starts developing what I call the alimentary metaphor, the metaphor of books as food for the mind. When a child has indigestion, we run to the doctor, we leave a deposit if need be, and we run to the apothecary. But when our child has indigestion, or you could translate it, corruption of the spirit through bad books, we pay no attention. We see the signs of bodily illness and are disturbed, but when our And by the way, this alimentary metaphor was not unique to Yiddish or to the Jews. One of my favorite quotations that I came across and was able to include in the book was from a public librarian in Boston, progressive era, somewhere around 1911, who said that we had to be careful not to feed our children that cheap kind of book pastry that, was not going to conduce to their well-being. So that was part of Breinen's argument. And he also talked about what I call the Yiddish effect. And it's not entirely clear to me whether he's speaking descriptively or prescriptively when he says, I personally name of one Shaikovich who wrote pulp fiction that just absolutely swept the Jewish world. I mean, this was like if you took Harry Potter in the 1990s with Danielle Steele, with, I don't even know like what the analogs would be, but combined all of them together. The best Yiddish writers have never been called to write for children, which in 1900 was pretty much true, or for the youth. It is self-evident for our thinking or thoughtful and educated Yiddish writers that we cannot educate our youth on jargon literature. Of the holiday cycle, of the liturgical cycle that they would have felt fully had they been living in Israel and working as agriculturalists in the land. So Breinen's idea is that we really need translation of European children's literature, or what was being received and read as children's literature, into Yiddish. Stories such as Andersen's fairy tales, which he calls Goddess Andersen, which were translated by Frischmann, were taken from this paragraph goes on, that he has some, now we would say, gendered concerns about the masculinity of Jewish boys in particular, and ways that reading could kind of toughen them up a little bit and bring them into better conformity with ideals of European masculinity. So, what came next? What came after this call that he issued in 1900 for translation? Well, a lot of translation activity into Yiddish, which was nothing unusual. Yiddish was gobbling up the world, and certainly Western Europe, through translation. But there starts to be a real sense of initiative about translating for children. And if you are curious and want to access any children's literature, you can certainly look to the website of the Yiddish Book Center. But the scans that were done using Yivo's collection and done by the Yiddish Book Center and posted on their website were done by people like me who got the kind of education that I did, which was that a book is a text. A book is the words that are written. But over the course of my career, since I've been out in the field, it has come to my attention that books are not only texts, that books are not only the words on the page, and that if we take an interest in books and in books as worlds and instruments of world making, we need to pay attention to the materiality of the text, much more so than had ever occurred to me at the outset of my career. So I am very much indebted to Florida Atlantic University, which has a beautiful collection of about 150, I think maybe 138 Yiddish children's books that have been scanned like this, in full color, right? So you're really getting something beautiful with stamps, with markings. On Bermejo Street in Buenos Aires. And if other people know more about this, we'll have a little time to talk at the end and you can fill me in. Just to give you a couple more examples, there's so much translation of Goddess Andersen, of the Hans Christian Andersen canon, that we actually have a 1911 version of Das Yam Mädel. From 1921, and you'll see that this is published by the Varsche Kulturliga. So the Culture League was the prestige publisher for Yiddish, for material for adults and eventually for children. And this one is 42 pages to the 16 pages of a decade prior. And it has a completely different set of illustrations. And one of the really wonderful printing conventions that we see in a lot of Yiddish children's books is they give us the tirage, the print run. And so we can see that there were 3,500 copies printed in Warsaw in 1921. It gives us something of an idea, at least, of what the publisher thought that they could sell. I gotta have a dad joke, I'm sorry. So the poet Eliezer Steinberg has a line in one of his poems, Kain is nicht Hevel, that chewing the cud is no mere vanity. It's not in vain, and of course this is a pun saying that Cain, biblical Cain, is not his brother Abel. Hevel is the same word, and Cain, the verb, sounds like Cain, the person. So in the same spirit of Cain is nicht Hevel, my own little mom joke is, un fe is nicht fe. We have an end paper here where I presume some young child was practicing the kind of refractory final letter fe, and it's a hard one to master, and the angle is a little bit non-standard, and I don't know that maybe this was another way of forming the Fae, and it was regional. I think David Brown walked in, and we'll have ideas about this, about Handschrift, but it certainly looks to me like the handiwork of a child. So how did these books come to be collected and preserved at Florida Atlantic University? So Professor Rachel Harris, who directs the Jewish Studies program down there, invited me to come and spend time with this collection and then give a library talk about what they had there and to kind of locate it, contextualize its significance. And I got there and I asked her and the special collections librarian, how did this group of books come to be here? And I am kind of inferring from the use of a few different end papers across books covering 4 decades from the aughts into the 30s, I'm inferring that these were bound sometime after their publication. And so right after I left town, Rachel hit the archives and she came up with this article from the Fort Lauderdale Sun-Sentinel, published tomorrow, but in 1994, October 24th, again, happy birthday to my mom tomorrow, about Mark Swatlow, who was the Judaica librarian at Florida Atlantic University and who had lived in Buenos Aires. And after the bombing of the AMIA, of the Buenos Aires Jewish Community Center in the summer of 1994, he sprang into action to go down and make sure that the books that were held at that cultural center could be preserved and rescued. So he brought the collection to Florida Atlantic University, and he apparently oversaw the binding of these books. And I think that for someone who really does know and is curious about the book as material object, this would be an absolutely fascinating, bounded, but rich collection to go down and investigate and learn more. All right. So now I want to transition from talking about that collection from the very beginnings of Yiddish children's literature to the book and the range that I focus on. And I seem to have done this in a little bit, I added something, that's the problem, and I added it out of order. But I want to just talk about the idea of Yiddish children's literature, the primary texts, the secondary texts. And I will say this is a transitional moment in the talk, so latecomers, please don't be shy. Come take a seat. I want to talk about the idea of the primary texts together with the research, to which, I've added a good pound and a half, as an idea ecosystem that can function together. And I had all of the academic ideas front-loaded, and we'll get to that in a moment, but then I added the very human impulse behind this research, which is that I am drawn to the idea of this literature as a joint cultural project to give Yiddish-speaking children and youth something better, something richer than the adults who created it had access to themselves. Because Yiddish children's literature does not arise slowly from the mists of time before we can trace it. No, I told you, it started in 1889, and it really picks up steam only after the Great War. It is a very historically discrete enterprise, and it arises in response to a set of specific needs. And so that idea of reaching down into ourselves and giving the children in our lives something that we ourselves did not have, that really speaks to me on a human level. Every children's literature is stamped by the conditions of its founding. And we can compare the Yiddish canon to the work of the Brothers Grimm, which did not start out as a commodity for children. It started out as a project of ethnography, really, to collect the genuine stories of the Teutonic folk before there was a political entity known as Germany. This literature comes about at a time of rapid social and religious change. There are new educational institutions, including co-educational institutions, and new gender norms and ideas about, well, there weren't so many new ideas about boyhood once we get into it, but there were a lot of new ideas about girlhood that get expressed through this literature. So Yiddish children's literature furnishes us a record of Jewish modernity that has been rather neglected. And major features of that entrance into modernity, including nationalism and more than one version of Jewish nationalism and secularization, it really opens a window onto almost everything Jewish and modern, or I should say Ashkenazi Jewish and modern. What was going on for the Jews of Eastern Europe during the decades when this literature was created was an age of mass migration, both due to push factors, primarily anti-Semitic violence in Eastern and Central Europe, and pull factors like economic opportunity in the Americas and principled commitments to Zionism that pulled some Jews, in small numbers at this point, to the land of Israel. Marriage and family life were changing profoundly during the years when Yiddish children's literature was developing. We really are seeing the rise and the wide diffusion of companionate marriage and the child-centered nuclear family. So whereas a marriage used to be an economic arrangement between two large extended families and then a container for the successful rearing of children, in these decades when this literature is developing, family comes to be understood as a platform for the emotional fulfillment of members of the family with children at the center. And finally, during these years, the whole discourse of childhood is changing in the West. And since this is a time of rationalism and scientific inquiry, we get a new science devoted to describing those changes in childhood and prescribing what childhood should be. Child psychology, the ideas and dictates of which are very clearly reflected in a lot of Yiddish children's literature. So I want to just give you a quick tour of the book through its table of contents, and then I want to read a little bit to you. So I have tried to organize this book, which is very ambitious and very global in scale, in relation primarily to time, but also inextricably to space. So we start with texts that orient themselves in relation to a Jewish past. It might be a well-documented, fairly recent historical Jewish past, but it might equally be a mythopoeic sense of the deep Jewish past that is romanticized. So I start out describing what we had before Yiddish children's literature. And what we had before publishing was stratified by age into children's literature and adult literature was a set of Ashkenazi Jewish reading practices stratified by gender. Men, if they were capable, if they received the education to do it, read in Hebrew and in the linguistic polysystem of Hebrew-Aramaic, the language of the Talmud and Jewish legal study. Women read in what was known as Mamaloshen, the mother tongue. And so young children, still in the orbit of their mothers, were part of that storytelling culture. And part of the task of boyhood was to embark on a kind of psychosexual or psycho-emotional transit from the reading world of the mother to the reading world of the father and the teacher, who was the symbolic stand-in for the father. I also talk in that first chapter about Shomer and the sense of threat. There was almost a moral panic about Shomer and what pulp fiction might represent. And that really created a sense of urgency that we need stories for children that are, again, going to nourish their minds, nourish their literary palate, and not poison them with too much romance or, Yiddish bodice rippers at the wrong age. Then I move on to a chapter that quickly, perhaps somewhat sloppily, perhaps in a way that will give my historian friends hives, recount the history of how Yiddish children's literature came to be in relation to the Great War and the events that followed from it. I move in chapter 3 into a microgenre of Sabbatarian tales, stories about very traditional Sabbath observance under vulnerable circumstances, which sound for all the world like old-fashioned Hasidic stories, but which are being written by educators who identify as secularists of one stripe or another, a Bundist, a labor Zionist, and disseminated in the secular Yiddish schools of first Europe and then New York and other places in the Americas. So that's a Sabbath for socialists, children's literature between the sacred and the secular. And that is an opportunity to think about folklore and the folkloric and what I call folklore, F-A-U-X-K-L-O-R-E, and ways that folklore gets embedded in Yiddish children's literature and tries to create a sense of continuity with an imagined past. And then finally, I move on to the construction of Yiddish boyhood in and through the school tale. Now, of course, the school that we're talking about is the very informal elementary school known as the cheder, which was simply the word that meant room because it was a room in the home of the teacher known as the malamed. And so this fourth chapter is room, the four walls of Jewish boyhood. And if you're a little bit sniffy and elitist, and you only want to read about already recognized canonical mandarins of Yiddish culture, this is the chapter for you, because this is where I juxtapose the kindred spirits of Sholem Aleichem and Isaac Bashevis Singer, who both wrote very psychologically similar, I think, stories in the same world as each other, psychologically similar stories about the boy on the margins. Boys in Yiddish literature are almost always represented in relation to a group, and our hero often has a somewhat troubled relationship. He's the participant observer, the insider-outsider, who is not really in sync with the group. I call these boys portraits of the artist as a young charity case, because it's often someone who has been helped into the cheder that his family can't quite afford to send him to. In part two, I move on to works that orient themselves in relation to a vision for the Jewish future, but of course, it's not all the same vision. There are different kinds of political ideology, not only written into these stories, but involved in their publication and dissemination through Yiddish school systems that are organized according to ideological lines. And so there are really a lot of different and contesting, mutually complementary, and in some cases mutually incompatible visions for what the Jewish and specifically Yiddish future should look like. In chapter 5, I think about the ideas that come of child psychology that are getting expressed in these stories through language of internal weather and the natural world. And I think about both a story by Meisha Kulbach about the wind getting angry and creating a blizzard, which I think is an allegory for a child's temper tantrum. And I think about the fiction that came out of a very real place, the Miriam Sanatorium, that was established as a healing institution, an institution for preventing the spread of tuberculosis, something like the Fresh Air Fund for mostly but not exclusively Jewish children, mostly but not exclusively from Warsaw. So children would go for somewhere between 3 weeks and 3 months. and they would live in a children's republic, and they would learn about how to operate in a democracy by voting on absolutely everything, and how to function in a bureaucracy by having committees devoted to absolutely every aspect of life at the sanatorium. And they had a wonderful nature center. They maintained a dovecot. They had a garden. They collected specimens from the natural world. They went on nature walks. And the nature teacher, one Yisrael Biber, wrote up these activities as 2 volumes of children's fiction so that when they went back home to the dirty city, the children could remember what they had experienced at Miriam, and so that the children who had never gotten a chance to go could also get a little taste of the ethos of the sanatorium. In chapter 6, I think about the construction of Yiddish girlhood. So if Yiddish-speaking boys were portrayed in relation to the group, girls were almost always portrayed alone. And the single most common plot line involving a girl protagonist is that our heroine is not where the adults in her life expect her to be. So Yiddish authors are imagining a world in which it's safe for girls to wander and to adventure, and then eventually to come back home none the worse for the wear. In chapter 7, I tried to unpack the mechanics of empathy that operated in so much of Yiddish children's literature. This is where we talk about plot lines involving wealth disparities and the need to redress them in some way. According to people's different ideological intuitions, they had different approaches to addressing wealth disparities. So some stories focus on very traditional charitable giving, tzedakah, while others teach children the mechanics of collective action and labor organizing, like when the forest-dwelling birds get together and strike on behalf of the caged birds living in cities. This is also where I talk about the subset of Yiddish children's literature produced in New York that was very consciously devoted to what today we would call anti-racism. In chapter 8, I think specifically about the Yiddish children's literature of the farthest or the furthest reaches of the left, those who styled themselves Die Linke, the communists. And I contrast the cases of the Soviet Union and the communism that flourished here in New York, although probably not so much here in this exact neighborhood. This chapter has a pretty simple thesis, which I hope is not too pat, which is that in the Soviet Union, particularly in the Stalinist years, parents are almost always depicted as missing or incompetent, deficient in some way, as if to reinforce the idea that the true monoparent is the state, and specifically in the person of Papa Stalin, as one story refers to him. Whereas in the American communist case, we have portrayals of very democratic decision-making within the family. So if in the Soviet context, the real family is the state and its leader, in the American context, the real state, the real democracy to which everyone has access is the life of the family. You cannot write about Yiddish and the 20th century without grappling with the effects of the events that come to be referred to as the Holocaust, or in Yiddish, what we call der dritter Churban, the third destruction after the destructions of the 2 temples in Jerusalem. So in part 3, I turn to the sobering task of reckoning with cataclysm and creativity. In chapter 9, I quote Udel Mark, the great educator and educational theorist and grammarian and children's author, when he says, "We may have sinned thereby against child psychology by keeping the children in our Yiddish schools, in our workman circle schools, informed about what was happening to their cousins, sometimes literal cousins in Europe, in real time." And I talk about the aesthetic and moral choices that were made in the depiction of the Holocaust for elementary-aged children. And since he is with us, I will quote my teacher, David Roskis, who said that if you got your Holocaust education from the movies, from Hollywood, you would think, number one, that all main characters actually survived, and it was only the people in the background who died. And number two, that those who did survive did so primarily by falling in love with a good Nazi. In other words, you would have a very distorted view of the history. And analogously, when it comes to children's literature, if you got your whole education about the Holocaust from Yiddish children's literature, you would think that main characters survive, and you would think that somewhere between 85 and 90% of the Holocaust was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. There is a disproportionate representation of this moment of clear resistance, including military resistance. But interestingly, children are almost always depicted as having non-violent, non-combatant roles and being involved in cultural preservation. In chapter 10, I turn to the representation, the indirect representation of the Holocaust for teenagers, for what we would today call a young adult market through historical fiction. And I conclude with the reinsertion of the Yiddish reading child into the Jewish eternal, into cyclical time, through the teaching of the alphabet and holiday stories that walk the child through the motifs associated with the calendrical year. And finally, because I knew that at every event someone would ask me about Yiddish children's literature today, I write about Hasidic herring and Swedish fish, the two places where Yiddish children's literature is still being published and is thriving. And I would like to conclude by reading a brief passage from that conclusion. I'm talking about the lively publication scene in the Hasidic world. The covers of the 5-volume Kinderspiel encyclopedia series, A Welt von Yiddish, A World of Knowledge, are not dissimilar to those of the 1 Million Things titles that my children loved thumbing through. But whereas my children might come across a picture of a sow nursing her piglets, or the telltale curves of a woman's silhouette on a page about human anatomy, Hasidic families choose these books and toys specifically to guard the eyes against such compromises. Looking at a pig is not tantamount to eating one, but if you avoid so much as looking at one, you certainly won't come to eat one. Quote, labeling certain texts as clean or kosher creates a parallel between reading and Jewish dietary laws, kashrus, notes Ayala Fader. Both Jewish dietary laws and the censoring of books are attempts to control what is put into the body and mind. So back to that elementary metaphor. A century and a half ago, secularist Yiddish cultural leaders were equally concerned about the literary diet of children in their ambit, giving rise to the invention of what I've called, perhaps so frequently as to be to the chagrin of Anne Savarese, what I've called Enlightenment kale chips. Hasidic families are less tolerant of modernity, but perhaps more tolerant of cake. Consider the Kinderspiel title, Yeshaiah's Upscheren, Isaiah's first haircut, brought to me as a gift by my friend Mike Moskowitz, who's here tonight, written by Rabbi Berel Seifer. The preschooler depicted on the book's cover, newly shorn and flanked by an older brother, his father, and his teacher, is about to lick honey off a tablet printed with the Aleph Beis, the Hebrew Yiddish alphabet. A celebratory cake stands at the ready. Contemporary Hasidim have fused this ceremony for a boy's first haircut at age 3 with the initiation rituals described in chapter 4 into one mega celebration of becoming visually legible as a boy with earlocks, yarmulke, and ritual fringes, a boy who studies Torah in the actual company of his teacher and the symbolic company of his father. But I want to talk about Yeshaya's cake. It is inscribed with 2 biblical verses in keeping with the instructions detailed in the 12th century code Sefer HaRokeach by Rabbi Elazar of Worms. The Torah initiation ceremony that he describes takes place on the holiday of Shavuos and seems to entail collective participation by a given town's little boys. Their exact age is not specified, and the Rokeach's language jumps between plural and singular, although the elements of the rite are clearly designed to evoke the revelation at Sinai. The boy is covered with a garment, lest he see a dog, emblem of impurity, on his way to commence learning. He is brought to the synagogue or the teacher's house and placed on his teacher's lap. A tablet bearing the Hebrew alphabet and a few simple verses is placed before him. One by one, he repeats the letters after his teacher, forward and backward. After all, the letters are the tools of world-making to be wielded capably in all directions. He repeats the verses word for word. Honey is smeared on the tablet for the boy to lick from the letters, cementing the association between sweetness and learning. Then comes the honey cake, incised with these ancient and puzzling words from Isaiah 50, verses 4 and 5. The Lord God gave me a skilled tongue to know how to speak timely words to the weary. Morning by morning, God rouses my ear to give heed like disciples. The Lord God opened my ears, and I did not disobey. I did not run away. Isaiah has preceded these words with a trenchant rebuke of the people's heedlessness, and he follows them with a declaration of his resolve to, quote, set his face like flint against all who would flog or insult him. He proclaims his defiance and fortitude under the blasting pressures of serving as God's mouthpiece. Again, instructs the medieval manual. The teacher reads word by word, and the new pupil repeats after him. It's not what I would think to write on a birthday cake. But, unlike Elazar of Worms, I have not lost my spouse and children in the Crusades. There's one more element in the Rokeach's version of the ceremony. The boy is served a peeled, hard-boiled egg inscribed with the words of Ezekiel 3:3. In the biblical context, the prophet has just been instructed to swallow a scroll. As God said to me, mortal, feed your stomach and fill your belly with this scroll that I give you. I ate it, and in my mouth it tasted sweet as honey. Rabbi Elazar instructs, predictably by now, that the teacher read the verse word by word and the boy repeat it. And they feed the lad, he concludes, the cake and the egg, because it is good for the opening of his heart. Yes, they feed him the sweet cake with its bitter words, and the mildly savory egg with its sweet ones, and he ingests it all. That the words were as honey was as true for Kadya Molodovsky and Sina Rabinovich, Leib Kvitko, and Levin Kipnis as it was for Ezekiel and Isaiah, for Elazar of Worms, and for the legions of little Menachem Mendels flung by their parents' sacred shlichus or mission to the four corners of this earth. As in the ceremony itself, there is a scrambling together, a simultaneity and fusion of Heimish late capitalist toy, game, book, music empires with medieval martyrdom and improbable survival, of ancient biblical verses with Upsharan party favors and Instagram-worthy tablescapes, of cartoonish illustrations with prophetic disenchantment, of an alphabet mastered forward and backward, pride in Jewish distinctiveness and shame at Jewish defenselessness, of salty and sweet, bitter and savory, and even as I write these words, of participant and observer. Yes, the cake and the egg together do indeed open the heart. Throughout these pages, I have argued that we can better understand the shape of a culture's aspirations by examining critically the materials that it hands to its children. As verbrannte Yiddishisten, fiery Yiddishists, did a century ago, we are still counting on children's literature to bequeath a legacy to a new generation, a set of vessels for them to fill and fulfill in new yet recognizable ways that connect past to future. A little boy ensconced in a prayer shawl differs in some important ways from a little girl under the blue parasolke that constituted her home and sky both. But they speak equally to an enduring Jewish cultural swaddling, a determination to wrap our children in story before sending them into the larger world. The earliest and most urgent parental prerogative, feed the baby, shades imperceptibly into nourishing the mind with books. Eat this, not that. Don't read that, read this. It's Heimish in Brooklyn. It's Hamish in Manhattan. The wish for a schönere und bessere Welt, a more beautiful and better world, that animated secular Yiddish children's literature is still alive and well in Borough Park, Williamsburg, and Kiryas Yoel. The same wistful longing for wholeness is discernible in the retrojection of an idealized past in which the chain of Yiddish fluency is imagined to have continued unbroken. But the wish is equally alive in Overland Park and Brookline, Mexico City, Toronto, and Modi'in, all places where the break with Yiddish is undeniable. The Yiddish children's literature of the 20th century satisfies a hunger the body politic has not been aware of even feeling. The time was right a century ago to consciously dismantle internalized Jewish shame and to replace it with a capacious vision of Jewish and human dignity. It is a quintessentially human urge to hand our children something more whole, more just, more perfect than what was handed to us. New life, perforce, demands new hope. Thank you. I have time if you have time.
Wait for the mic to ask your question, because otherwise the people at home can't hear you. In fact, they can't hear me right now. Please, questions?
Yeah.
Take it away, Miriam. I'll ask the first one if you want. I love doing that. Okay. So in your years of exploring this, when you started, were there scholars that thought this was second-rate material? Were there libraries that didn't have it well cataloged? Were there people who didn't understand why this was your chosen material on the tables?
So there was very little critical scholarship on Yiddish children's literature. There is one really beautiful monograph by the late Naomi Prower-Kadar, whom I never had the opportunity to meet and who feels like a kindred spirit because I read her book very closely. It focuses on the 4 Yiddish organizations that operated periodicals for Yiddish reading children in New York. And there is also a wonderful dissertation written in Hebrew, parts of which have been published as articles, although the whole thing has not been published as a book. And there are articles here and there, but really very little. And it was something of an upward climb to persuade colleagues that this was going to be a worthy inquiry and field of study. And, you know, I was fortunate that there were these digitized resources and that I had such a very texty textual orientation that I wasn't bothered by the difficulty of access. For the questions that I was answering or that I was looking into, trying to answer, the digitized texts really were enough. And then, of course, we had the pandemic, and I'm so grateful to the graduate students who were in New York and were able to make some trips to YIVO and send me lots and lots of photographs of crumbling pages. Yeah. Other questions? Please. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a most illuminating lecture. This person certainly learned an awful lot.
Illumination seems to be the theme here.
One question. Our contemporary children's books, and even going back into the 19th century, are very much dependent upon illustrations. The only illustrations you showed were some, as I say, a doré and some kind of, is there any, what is the situation with the illustration of the contemporary Jewish child's book?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it mostly, as far as I can discern, comes down to resources, to money. As more resources begin to be directed toward this enterprise, particularly as we get into the 1930s and beyond, we see magnificent illustrations start to be included in these works. Let's see, there are so many that I could highlight. I will say that outside of the Soviet Union, there is almost no color illustration, and there's precious little even in the Soviet Union. But we have magnificent line drawings and woodblock prints. And one that I'll highlight were the illustrations that Louis Bunin did for the Lobzik stories about a very lovable mutt who gets adopted by the family of Beryl, the sewing machine operator who lives in the Bronx. And Lou Bunin, I don't know how many people know the rest of his work, but he did this absolutely incredible animated Alice in Wonderland, and he really had just kind of a whimsical flair, and he makes Lobzik kind of pop off the page. And I'm happy to say that with my translation of all 12 Lobzik stories that will be published in 2026, we are able to use both those original Lou Bunin illustrations and some newly commissioned illustrations. Yeah.
So I actually love the story about the guy from Florida Atlantic running down to Buenos Aires to save the books after this this trauma. And I'm wondering, first of all, whether the books that he brought back, did anyone else in the United States have copies of those books? And the kind of related question of, do you have any sense of, like, is it the range of stuff that you were able to see and that's been preserved a small corner of what was published or a large part of what was published?
Yeah, great. So I'm pretty sure that the number is 138 books in that collection, which represents a very small fraction. We have almost 1,000 freestanding books, meaning not the periodicals, but the actual books, some of which are just little picture books and some of which are thick anthologies or chrestomathies, which are anthologies with a kind of educational purpose. And YIVO has most, but not all, of what FAU has. And I would say that the FAU collection is particularly strong on the first decade to 2 decades of Yiddish children's publishing activity. That's really where their collection shines. And the oldest book that I remember seeing there that I noted and said, oh, wow, I've never seen this anywhere else, was from 1905. Do you want to call on people? I saw Val's hand and Sheva's hand and Wendy up front. Are we waiting for the microphone? Oh.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could help us a little bit flesh out maybe the relationship of the emergence of Yiddish children's literature to the emergence of Yiddish literature as such in general, and how you would sort of discuss that relationship.
Yes. So the emergence of high culture fiction and, fine arts, Yiddish literature, is a good 4 to 5 decades ahead of the project of Yiddish children's literature. And one of the ways that I love to index that very efficiently is that the collected works of Mendel Amoicher Sfarim, who is widely regarded as the first Yiddish novelist, are prefaced by a kind of romanticized, lightly fictionalized life-writing version where he comes to explain how he, a mere mortal named S.Y. Abramovich, came to be Mendel, the book peddler that everyone knows. And he tells the story of being an itinerant peddler or of becoming an itinerant peddler because he has this pathology, this pathological illness of being in love with nature. And he's writing in a very ironic vein. He thinks that being in love with nature is a good thing, or Abramovich thinks that it's a good thing. And Mendele, his literary creation, has to be ashamed of it. He's kind of under this cultural pressure to be ashamed of how much he loves nature, but he realizes, you know what? Sell your wife's pearls. You'll get some capital. You'll buy a wagon. You'll get some chapbooks. You'll get some holy books. You'll go out from place to place and you'll sell these books and you'll make a living that way. And you can look at the brooks and the streams and the geese and the trees and it'll be good, right? So he has to write about the love of nature, ironically, in the 1870s. But fast forward 50 years, and we get an almost identical description of the lyrical beauties of the natural world, delivered in a completely sincere vein by Yankov Fichman, talking about Lipa the tailor and how he loved going through the forest on his way to his work as an itinerant patcher. So there's this sort of shift where ideas that could only be elaborated in an ironic way in the 1860s and 1870s, romantic notions can be fully embraced and idealized for children 40, 50 years later. Yeah. This side of the room, to Val.
I'm not Val, but that's okay.
To Sheva first and then to Val.
I'm wondering if you can know at all, and maybe actually just holding some of these books in your hand, how much children actually read these books. As a student in a Yiddish school myself, we didn't, in our spare time, we didn't normally choose a Yiddish book.
Which is thematized in a Yiddish children's story.
Which story is that?
That's The Alphabet Gets Angry by Moshe Shifres, about little Michale, who on the eve of the first day of school goes to bed and realizes that he was supposed to read his Yiddish Bichala and review during the summer, and he hasn't. And the letters actually jump off the page, and they come one by one with their various shapes and propensities, and they attack him physically. So the Gimel, with its little gimme boots, marches all over his stomach with, this heavy tread, and the final nun, the longer nun, spears him again and again with its pointy tail, So anyway, as you were saying, the children did not always read the Yiddish books, and the creators of the books knew that fact.
Yeah. No, I thought it was really interesting when you showed that Faye.
Yeah.
Because at least maybe a child had picked up this book.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
So I believe that the next frontier in this project is to do the reception history and figure out how these books moved through the Jewish world. And one of the things that I learned by being a fellow at the Center for Jewish History last year is that I am not a historian. I think that's a wonderful set of questions, and I am neither equipped nor interested enough for myself to be the one who goes and does that spade work. But I hope to work very closely with the graduate student who decides to. Over to Val.
You want to do 2 more questions?
Hi.
Sure. And I saw Wendy's hand.
Thank you, Miriam, for a really lively and riveting presentation. Actually, your description of the story about the letters attacking the
Michele, poor Michele.
child,
Yeah.
it's not a bad segue to my otherwise pretty random question, because it reminded me of a Russian Chukovsky story where. Moy Dadir, where a wash basin
Yes.
and actually everything else in the house attack this boy who doesn't want to wash his face. So my question was really, as someone who was raised on Soviet children's literature, I was curious if any of that stuff was translated into Yiddish, like Chukovsky, Marshak, Malchisha ki Balchisha. I would love to see the Yiddish version of Malchisha ki Balchisha.
I can't believe I didn't plant this question. Yes, continue.
Yeah, no, that's my question. I'm just curious.
All right. So this is this is treated extensively in the chapter on the communists, and this is one of my favorite things to talk about because I am greatly devoted to a narrative poem that I translated for my anthology, Honey on the Page, called Boots und die Sanitaren, Boots and the Bath Squad, and it is the Yiddish Moidadir, and it is no accident that Chukovsky becomes aware of the work of Leib Kvitko and becomes his champion and arranges for Kvitko to be translated into Russian, and he goes from having print runs of 3,500, 6,000 to, and I kid you not, I checked and rechecked this because I could not believe it, print runs in Russian of 10 million copies. Yeah. So Chukovsky is great. There's a lot to talk about there. And Samuel Marshak is absolutely translated very delightfully into Yiddish. A Maisa mit a Ketzele, a story of a kitten, is one that teaches really well, by the way. Has a lot of, for the Yiddish Sprachlehrers here, it has a lot of household item vocabulary. Misha.
I can't thank you enough. This has just been extraordinarily illuminating, just filled with so much information. I can't believe you packed this much into an hour. I have a number of random questions. Of course, this is not in any way my area of expertise, but I hope you will humor me. The first is, I think in terms of establishing a canon of Yiddish children's literature, and perhaps whether or not there were sort of hierarchies of, that parents who want to be good parents want to make sure that their children are exposed to certain kinds of books or certain authors or thinking about a canon, and then also thinking from an academic perspective, has there been a trajectory of professors like yourself who have, over the past, 110 years or 120 years, there hasn't been that long of a period of time, have there been professors who have dedicated themselves to this kind of study? And the third question, again, very random.
Yeah.
It sounded to me like there was a really tremendous concentration of activity in Warsaw, but I wondered whether or not there were other hotspots in terms of these types of specific focused concentration of children's literature publication in Yiddish? So those were my 3 questions.
That's great. I'm going to start with the third question. So the hotspots, the publishing centers really move with the people, and they track with Yiddish cultural centers and publishing centers for adults. That's where the infrastructure is. So it's Warsaw and Vilnius, Vilna, as it was known in Yiddish, is known in Yiddish. Kharkiv and Kiev in Ukraine, very important during the Soviet period. Really good firm footing gets established in New York by the 1920s. And then after the Holocaust, Buenos Aires and Mexico City also become very important publishing centers. There's some publishing activity in Montreal. There's some publishing activity in Detroit and Los Angeles and Tel Aviv. So, it kind of depends where people are. Now, I'm going to try to answer both the questions about parents, for which I don't have a lot of evidence, and educators by telling you about another frontier, which is the next rabbit hole that I've fallen into in relation to this material, which is that there was a lively discourse in the Yiddish pedagogical literature of the Yiddish schools about how to use these materials in the classroom. And that same Udel Mark that I mentioned, who said that in writing the Holocaust stories, we might have sinned against child psychology, so he really has an awareness of child psychology. He edits and is the kind of animating spirit behind a publication called Pädagogischer Bulletin. And he encourages the professionalization of Yiddish teachers and teaching, and you can see so many interesting storylines and historical developments and cultural developments by following the discussion in these pedagogical publications. You can see the trouble that the New York-based schools are having with pronunciation of those refractory ch sounds. You can see a moment at which they start talking about the need for discipline in the Yiddish classroom. It had never been a topic before. And what are the enlightened ways to discipline our students? What about the role of modern Hebrew? Because now our students are starting to also orient themselves toward Hebrew. How is that going to affect Yiddish? And how should we be pronouncing Lashon Kodesh, Hebraically derived words in our Yiddish now that our students are encountering this other pronunciation system? Wendy, maybe we'll give you the last question. If we can find the microphone. Yeah.
I was just really intrigued by the idea of the girls getting lost, and I was curious whether you had a sense of what kind of cultural work is that performing? Why are these girls getting lost? Why would the authors want to describe the girls in that way?
Great. So this topic is one of a few really central ones that really speak to the idea of this as a culture of aspiration, because the fiction of girls getting lost is really developed during the progressive period against the backdrop of a broader American discourse of wayward girls and fallen girls and the kind of social necessity of preventing girls from falling and making sure that they can get educated and set on a good path. And this is also the period when elite college education for women is flourishing at the Seven Sisters. And part of what's going on in the Yiddish world is a desire to take these educational aims and democratize them and make them broadly available. So imagining a world in which a girl can go out and be lost, and maybe she has a kind of flighty dad who takes her along to mail a letter, and instead of sticking the letter into the mailbox, he sticks in his daughter, and she travels with the mail on the ship all the way from Buenos Aires to Poland, and then comes back on the next ship, right? Those of you who know your 20th century Jewish history know that the story of girls traveling alone on ships from Poland to Buenos Aires is not a happy one, but this is a total revision of what was referred to as the white slave trade, right? It's a total revision of that kind of story into something palatable, playful, joyful, and safe. So it is a way of kind of embedding these hopes about what girls could experience, do, be, and attain within a plot arc. And with that, I will say that we have cake. Of course we have cake.